Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Good afternoon. It's yet again a great pleasure to be here with you. The title of this session is The Clash of Cultures. I actually prefer The Clash of Civilizations because that's exactly what it is. We need to step back and consider the big picture if a discussion of radical Islam is to be productive. In 1924, the caliphate was abolished. What happens next can be seen as the second great schism in the history of Islamic thought. The first one, as you know, was the one over the succession of the Prophet Muhammad. He had left no succession plan, and his followers had to figure out who should lead them. One school of thought was to consult the Sunnah, or the example of the Prophet. The leader should be among the best of us, they said, and these people are labeled the Sunnis, and they consist today of roughly 85% of Muslims. The other group was the Shia. They are the ones who argued to have a blood relative of the Prophet installed as leader. None of Muhammad's children outlived him except his daughter Fatima. Fatima married Muhammad's cousin, Ali ibn Abi Talib. Her son, the Prophet's nephew, was to be crowned God's deputy on earth. This first great schism led to a period of intense fighting and bloodletting in that early period, and the dispute never healed to this day. The Shia make up only 15% of Muslims today, maybe less. In the years after 1924, Muslim clerical and political leaders disagreed on steps after the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the last caliphate of Islam. One viewpoint was to westernize and agreed with European powers to break up Muslim lands into nation states modeled along European or Western norms. These leaders suggested that Islam would be a major part of their national identity, but the state would have the last word on legislation, on military, and on foreign affairs. The other side wanted to revive the caliphate and restore its original mission of advancing Islam to all parts of the world. For this group, consisting of senior clerics, politics and Islam is and was inseparable. They set about discussing how to revive the caliphate through a series of conferences, starting with the one they held in Al-Azhar, called the Caliphate Conference, or the Al-Azhar Conference, and they held this in Cairo in 1926. Now, as you know, Cairo was then, and probably still is, the most prestigious university in the Muslim world. The pro-caliphate revivalists are what we call Islamists today. Islamism, with all its factions, be it the Shia variant, like the one in Iran, or it is very many Sunni manifestations, rejects the separation of politics from religion. The state must govern according to the Quran and the Sharia. It's an understatement to say that in the last 100 years, the relationship between the two Muslim groups, those who rejected the caliphate and those who want it back, to be dramatic. They have made attempts to persuade one another, to co-opt one another for each other's short-term and long-term goals. They have denounced one another, and they've brutally murdered one another. The anti-caliphate leaders of Islam held political power and still do with the help of Western, Soviet, Russian, and now even Chinese great powers. But the pro-caliphate Islamists have developed a strategy to topple the anti-caliphate rulers of Muslim-majority countries And in their aims, they even go further. The Management of Savagery, a strategic document for jihadi groups, published, I think, in 2004 or 2006, was found, and it identifies several countries as their priority group for creating chaos and establishing control. The countries specifically mentioned include Jordan, Egypt, the Maghreb, or some North African countries, that's Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. They mention Nigeria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. And I think now, having set the scene, we can discuss. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Noah Rothman. I'm a senior writer with National Review. It is an absolute privilege to be here with you today. And I wanted to start with the threat posed by domestic Islamist terrorism. In recent years, the menace, the prospect of great power conflict has dominated the national discussion. As such, our near-peer competitors dominate our field of view. We've lost sight of the threat posed by Islamist terrorism, and I think the evidence for that is in the way we talked about, or didn't talk about, the New Orleans terror attack in January. It kind of passed from the national discourse rather quickly. And perhaps that was attributable to a variety of phenomena. You can expound on that. But the way we talk about it as a product of self-radicalization, which is perhaps the wrong way to think about it. It's not as though this guy was surfing TikTok and became an Islamist terrorist. These are well-funded, organized networks. According to the Biden administration, many of them are in sub-Saharan Africa, as opposed to the Middle East or North Africa, or even Europe, where we have a fair amount of reach. Is the threat of Islamist terrorism, the domestic threat, our ability to respond to it, rather, is that limited by the paradigm, the lone wolf paradigm? Does that handcuff us and not help us to fully understand and comprehend this phenomenon and the threat it poses?
Absolutely. This is why I went back to 1924, why I make this distinction between those people who are pro-caliphate and those who are anti-caliphate. I think the way we define the problem is wrong. It's wrong for a number of reasons. It's wrong because it trivializes it. We delude ourselves that it's something that we can manage. It's wrong because we underestimate those pro-caliphate groups. And in the last 100 years, if you ask me, what has been the strongest helper of the pro-caliphate group? It is the ability for the world to underestimate them and for them to exploit that underestimation. So we talk about lone wolves, and that is very attractive to them because we're not talking about the big picture. We're not talking about their great strategy. We're not looking at what they achieved in the last 100 years. We're not looking at their objectives and at their methodology. We underestimate them when we talk about terrorism. We declared war on terror. That is, from their perspective, about the stupidest thing we could do, because terror is merely a tactic, and they have a whole arsenal of tactics that we're not looking into.
Maybe you could distinguish tactics from the grand strategic objective of transnational Islamist terrorism. In this grand strategic narrative, I think first you've got to understand the objective, this revival of the caliphate, and they've got to ask themselves, how do we get there? And to get there, they do what we no longer do. They strategize and they plan. And part of the strategy is, yes, how to use violence. When you go through this document called The Management of Savagery, the first phase of that document, it describes 3 phases. And the first phase they call vexation. I didn't translate it from the Arabic, so it doesn't sound like first-class translation from the Arabic to the English for me. But what it amounts to is the provocation of the targets, whether it's the pro-caliphate Muslim countries, which is their first target, or whether it's us. It is to provoke, to create a scene of chaos, provoke more violence, target vital economic
places like in those countries, and it is oil reserves, petroleum reserves. But the point is to exhaust the target. And then the second point that they want to achieve is to draw in Muslims into their narrative using that violence. So they create this, what they call the arc of chaos, and in that, there is a vacuum of security. We've seen them do things like this in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and unfortunately, they're doing it in Europe at the moment, where you create a situation where the public no longer trusts the government to grant order. So this great disorder. And then finally, they want to come in and manage the savagery or the violence. So when you see this slitting of throats, the beheadings, you've only just seen it in Syria, what they're doing to the Christians and to the Alawites. None of that is just mindless violence for the sake of violence. It's very, very strategic. And it harks back to the early days of the Prophet, the early days of Islam. And the messaging, it's signaling to Muslims, if you're a true Muslim, you join us because we are the ones who are doing exactly what the Prophet wanted us to do. So there is nothing, everything they do is really strategic, it's calculated, whether it is violent. There are no lone wolves. Why are there no lone wolves? Because on the one hand, again, to go back to 1924, those pro-caliphate groups, when they were meditating on how did we get here, how did the Ottoman Caliphate collapse, many of the clerics said, it's because we forgot the mission itself. And Hassan al-Banna emerged in 1928. 3 years from now, it's 100 years since the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood. And Hassan al-Banna's message, and others like him, was we've got to start a grassroots process of first developing the iman or the faith of the individual and strengthening it, then that of the family, then that of the society, and so on and so forth. So now you have the non-violent Islamization process that is overseen by groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, that is international and universalist in its approach. And then you have the military offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood, like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Hamas, engaging in this strategic violence. And that's a well thought through strategy that fits very well into one another. And we underestimate it because we talk about lone wolves. We try to chase terrorism across the world. We allow them to establish this great infrastructure for Islamizing, for creating that pipeline through nonviolent means in America and in Europe. So we are stupid and they're smart. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm mischaracterizing it. We've talked about this rather detestable document, The Management of Savagery, Abu Bakr Naji, who claims to have been inspired by a 14th century Islamic scholar. It is, if I would characterize it, as something of a blueprint for the destruction and co-option of Western societies by Islamist elements, the mobilization of sectarian violence, they're producing violence, destabilizing those societies, co-opting them, and then how to manage the tyranny that you've established going forward.
That's right.
Is there an example of how this process worked out in an actual state? Does it depend extensively on domestic fifth columnists? Can it be entirely foreign directed? How do you see it?
I think that's a very good question because, again, it redirects our attention to look at their strategy and see where have they, if you just evaluate what they have done, where have they been successful and where have they failed? So go back to the 1970s in Afghanistan, when Afghanistan was held by the Soviet Union. They identified that as a place that was a weak state. They settled. The strategy of settling, again, adopted from the Prophet Muhammad leaving Mecca and going to Medina and blending in with the population, that settlement process, the infiltration, etc., that is a strategy they use over and over again. So you look at what they've achieved through ups and downs in Afghanistan, where they had to fight with the Soviet Union, where they attracted Muslims from all over the world, where they were encouraged by the great Western powers to go, because of course the Western power was more focused on the Soviet Union than they were focused on the Islamists as a threat. And once the Islamists had removed, once they had removed the Soviet Union, America lost its focus and left them to do what they wanted to do, which was to settle Afghanistan and to use it as a launch pad from where they can wage this jihad and attract young people. They attacked us on 9/11, 2001. We went to Afghanistan, spent a lot of blood and treasure, and then left in the most shameful manner during the first Biden administration, or I hope the only Biden administration. And now you go back, and the Taliban, which worked very closely with Al-Qaeda, and which also holds the viewpoint of the revival of the caliphate, is in charge with a lot of money and arms and military means that we have given to them. So don't put yourself in your shoes, but you put yourself in their shoes. Would you characterize that as a success or a failure? We're watching the exact same thing happen in Syria. I think they're going to move on to Iraq. They did what we called the Arab Spring. To them, it is part of this strategic document, which is part of the causing of chaos, the creating of chaos, creating that security vacuum that they then come and fill.
I want to ask you about the significance of the short-lived, but still fascinating and equal parts terrifying Islamic State caliphate. This, to me, seemed like a fascinating experiment. It was the first alternative theory of social organization that I feel like we've seen since the collapse of Soviet-style communism. Even in states like Iran and China that organize themselves distinctly, you still see the outlines of an industrial capitalist Westphalian state. It was very different from the model that we saw in the ISIS caliphate. Can you describe to us how that departs from the Western model, the global model at this point, in law, economics, social organization, and what the challenge is to the West?
So it departs from the Western model. It rejects the Western model. It rejected the Western model from 1924 and said, no, we have to go back to our own civilizational model, the caliphate. And what it does, it differs in three ways. So number one, it is political authority. It doesn't seek political authority through the nation state, but it wants to go back to that infrastructure of the caliphate. The second is legitimacy. It seeks to convince Muslims worldwide that the nation states under which they live are illegitimate because they are un-Islamic, and it puts Islam at the center of politics. So being a Muslim, your first act of worship is to pursue this caliphate. So legitimacy that it seeks to find from Muslims. Muslims who are born Muslim or who are converted, who are married into, or who are conquered, it doesn't matter, but Muslims. And then, of course, the third, where it departs from our model, is, so it's the legitimacy, it's the authority, and it's in its mission and purpose. And the mission and purpose of the caliphate, as they present it, is as a civilizational alternative for the other civilizations. They mean not only, once you have to ask yourself, what will they do if they succeed in achieving this caliphate? The third mission, the third objective is to globalize the caliphate, to attack. Young men will be inducted into war, and they'll be trained and they'll be deployed to go and expand the caliphate. So in all of these three ways, it's very, very different from the Western vision of not just a nation state, but also international rules-based order, collaboration and competition in the ways that we, the West, have been dictating since 1945.
So I want to return to that in a little bit, but let's go back to the Trump administration 1.0. They demonstrated pretty decisively that you don't have to just live with the Islamic State caliphate. You can crush it. And they were very successful in doing that. But if we look back at the debate that we had after 9/11, there was, and remains, arguments between those who say Islamic terrorism needs to be confronted militarily, abroad, and preemptively, and those who maintain that this is more or less a problem of law, that the courts can manage it at home, and soft power institutionalism can mitigate the threat abroad. That debate is still ongoing, even though it's probably pretty settled in this room. But what do you think the course of that debate has been over the course of 25 years? And have we gotten it right? Are the critics of preemption vindicated, or are its supporters vindicated? And did the Biden administration really marry the two with its over-the-horizon approach, such as it is?
So what we've done since 9/11, I think, is that the soft power approach, I think of it as the soft-headed approach. Let's try it in our criminal courts. It's not a war. We've run that experiment. So now we have it's no longer hypothetical. We have the empirical evidence that the application of this soft-headed, soft power methodology works to help them. It doesn't work for us. Europe is on the brink of falling to them. The United Kingdom, Germany, France, Sweden, these countries are on the brink of falling into the sort of security chaos that they crave, number one. Number two, we have in our own midst not just the ideological narrative of the caliphate, but some twisted form of communism that is a remnant of the Soviet Union, what we've come to call the progressive wokeism, or whatever that virus is. And the Islamists have succeeded in working together to degrade and dismantle our own institutions. And I think the third and most problem that we have, and that the Islamists take full advantage of, is the evaporation of our creedal confidence. So do we want to really have this fight and win? Then they have that civilizational narrative, the references to Muhammad and his victories, the references to the caliphate, the romance of winning and conquest. And we have narratives that everything that our civilization is founded on is all negative and bad, that all we've done is occupy other countries and steal their resources, that we've only enslaved other peoples. So in many ways, they understand as our divisions and exploit those divisions better than we understand them and exploit their divisions.
Is it a bigger threat, that lack of civilizational confidence that you're describing? Can that threat be distinguished from foreign-directed, strategic, tactical, terrorist activity? Or is it just distinguishing these two a fool's errand, and they are complementary conditions?
In the Islamist narrative, they are completely married. It is one and the same thing. It is the aim to reestablish the caliphate. Is not just the caliphate for the caliphate's sake. The caliphate has a mission and it has a purpose. It is rooted in civilization and it's rooted in history. And if you look at what we are doing in the West, we are saying we can either apply police and justice means to spy on them, which is exactly where they want to have us, because that's going to exhaust us and it's going to exhaust our ability to maintain law and order, and or use military might, which again is very expensive and which they use for their propaganda narratives and their perception formations for the Muslims. But we can never, our governments, from the Bush administration and even prior to the Bush administration, Clinton, all the way back to Carter, our governments, whether they're on this side of the Atlantic or the other side of the Atlantic, have never been able to explain to Western populations why we have this conflict and why we need to win it on the civilizational level. We've never done that. And so we're actually, in many ways, I think we are years and years behind from waging this ideological war. We've done it before with the Soviet Union. We could do it, we could win, but we aren't doing it. And when you asked me about Trump 1.0, I think Trump 1.0 had two, in my view, good steps. One was to use that military might of the United States in this surgical way of removing ISIS, demonstrating to them, we are more powerful than you are. But it wasn't followed up with an ideological, with a civilizational, creedal clash or alternative. And the second one was the Abraham Accords. And by developing the Abraham Accords and putting it in place, that administration succeeded in understanding this division between those in the Middle East and the Arab world who want the caliphate and those who don't want it, and then garnering and getting those who don't want the caliphate to act finally and not just accommodate them.
So let's talk about Trump 2.0, because you've raised a concern that I have about the Abraham Accords in particular and Iran. So as I see it, the Abraham Accords had two pillars that made them possible. The first was to take the Palestinian issue, put it on the back burner. That's not what we solved first, it's what we solved last. The second was to reorient the Sunni states towards containing Iranian aggression. Those two things combined to create this rapprochement between Israel and its neighbors that had been sub rosa previously, is now out in the open. Trump 2.0 seems to be reversing that formula, in my view. It is elevating the Palestinian condition back to the status that it had prior to the Abraham Accords in the region. And it's focused on at least the prospect, not ruling out, the prospect of another Iranian nuclear deal. And the Obama administration's effort to ingratiate itself with Iran and give it free latitude in Iraq is what created the incentives for the Saudi kingdom and others to orient themselves against Iran. So I'm a little concerned that they're taking their eye off the ball in that regard.
Yeah.
Theoretically, this administration clearly has a better handle on Islamist terrorism than its predecessor. Mm-hmm. But do you have confidence that it's going to finish the job it started in 2016, 2017?
That depends. And here's what it depends on. If we define the Islamist challenge as a civilizational challenge, and the Trump administration being a transitional administration, they have departed in many ways from, the doctrines of their predecessors. I think there is a possibility for the Trump administration to say, we're dealing here with a civilizational, with an ideological war, and we're going to take this big picture view, and then in that scenario, no, they will not let Iran develop a nuclear bomb. They will not let the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Egyptians get away with saying, we've banned the Muslim Brotherhood and we're fighting Islamism, but we're allowing it to thrive in your own countries. Lately, the Saudis and the Emiratis have been saying, we've banned the Muslim Brotherhood, you need to ban them too. But what the Trump administration would do is get those people in a room and say, let's go together, Muslims and non-Muslims, after the ideology. That would be the way I would approach it. But as long as we're approaching it using the Western model and the Western prism of nation states, I think the Islamists have the winning hand.
You had mentioned this before, I want to return to it. Internal jihadist politics.
Yes.
So there are actually significant divisions, and one of the big debates sort of mirrors our own in a funhouse way. There is an internal debate over the utility of the globalism of pan-Islamism,
yes,
as represented by, for example, Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda, which had a globalist objective. The alternative to that is sort of a more populist, nationalist version of Islam that would create Islamism, that would create something of a caliphate in one state and then project terrorism and export its ideology. Mm-hmm. From there, is a populist style Islamism, does it have the prospect to be more popular and therefore more threatening to Western interests than a purely military threat represented by non-state actors exporting terrorism to the West?
Islamism in its core is populist. First of all, it is anti-establishment. It is saying the leaders of the existing nation states that are Muslim, those are illegitimate. So in that sense, it's anti-establishment, against the authority. Number one, and then number two, it has been very adept at pointing out that globalization has only benefited the very few. I mean, during the Arab Spring years, they were showing online the way the Saudis and the Qataris and the Bahrainis lived. In Saudi Arabia, drinking alcohol is banned. And I think, punishable by something like 15 years in prison. Having sex before marriage gets you into either fornication rules or adultery rules, all punishable. All of these things. And they were showing the elite, the ruling class, in France, in Cannes, here in America, enjoying themselves and engaging and indulging in all the Western sins with caviar and champagne, while at home people were starving. So if you want to say, what do the Islamists were actually really adept at showing these economic disparities, and part of the reason why I think the Arab, whatever they call the Arab Spring, delivered more support for Islamism than it delivered for the ones who were seeking Western-style liberal changes and the like. And so, yes, they do have a populist bend. They have a narrative that is more effective and more appealing to the audiences all across what used to be the Muslim world. The governments in power, I mean, take Egypt, for instance. Egypt is terrified of, the Egyptian government is terrified of the effect that transporting 500,000 or 1 million people from Gaza and resettling them in Egypt, the effect that it could have in Egypt, because it could topple that government and the Islamists could come to power. So yes, it's a civilizational narrative. It's a coherent narrative. It's a very, very strategically smart and cunning story that exploits Western divisions very, very adeptly. So you know of this term, the watermelon, where Islamists, the Green-Red Alliance, Islamists work together with communists or neo-communists. In that relationship, the neo-communists read their works. Ask yourself, what is their objective? Read through intersectionality narratives, read through critical theory, read through every aspect of the neo-Marxist, neo-Maoist, neo-Leninist. You'll never ever get to understand what exactly their objectives are once they've torn down this civilization. Do the same with the original documents of the Islamists. And the Islamist narrative is coherent, it's rooted in civilization, they have a vision. On a local level, they're first going to impose Sharia, and then they're going to expand it regionally, and then from there they're going to wage war, and they're going to bring Islam under the banner of Islam, under God's banner. That story is populist, it's much more appealing, and it's stronger, more potent, and more dangerous than what is on offer at the moment.
This marriage of ideological convenience that you're describing, it's sort of improbable, but all of them share one strategic objective, which is the end of the American century.
Yes.
The displacement of the United States as the preeminent global power. Do they talk about us in the way I would talk about, for example, Iran? Iran is the head of the snake. You can go after Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, the Shiite militias in Iraq and in Jordan and what have you all you want. But you're just sidestepping around the issue. Yes. And then there's another school of thought that says you truncate these groups in their orbit. You're in Iran's orbit, you eliminate them and gradually draw the circling closer to the head of the threat. Do they see us in the same way? Are there smaller targets to knock off before we get to the great Satan?
The great Satan, yeah. Absolutely. They talk about us all the time, and they talk about us, I find, in ways smarter than the way we talk about them. For instance, they talk about infiltrating our institutions, and they have done that. They talk about settling us, and you've seen, I gave you a document called the Explanatory Memorandum that was found in 1993, I suppose. Andy McCarthy is here. Did you find it? It is a Muslim Brotherhood internal, yeah, and it was during the Holy Lands Foundation, so it wasn't intended to be found. But I recommend that you read it. The document was authored in 1991, and now nearly 35 years on, you look at what they have achieved based on what they put in that document, and it's staggering. They've established an amazing infrastructure in the United States of America. They have, demographically, they've increased through immigration, chain immigration, conversions, and they have managed to keep the people they identify as Muslim cocooned in the infrastructure that they established. They speak for all Muslims in the United States. So they understand us better than we understand them. They talk about us. They talk about the fact that our relationship with Russia and the way that we feel that Russia is a threat, and they exploit that. They talk about our relationship with China, and they exploit those divisions, even though on a civilizational level, and again, I can't recommend Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations more, even though the CCP sees radical Islam as a threat and deals with radical Islam in the most brutal manner possible. Look at what they've done to the Uyghurs. And even though Russia has got this duplicitous manner of dealing, using the Islamists when they need them and suppressing them when they need them, Islamists, in trying to bring down the West, look at both of these countries and our divisions with them and exploit those divisions.
I want to close by giving us all nightmares.
Isn't this a nightmare?
What is the terrorist event scenario that really keeps you up at night? Not just because of the event itself, but the implications of it.
The fall of Europe. It's the fall of Europe. It's the fall of the United Kingdom is on the brink. The government of Sweden, the Prime Minister said a few weeks ago that he has lost control of the monopoly of violence, that his government has lost control of the monopoly of violence. He was very honest, but I think in many ways that's where Germany is at, where France is at, and those countries falling like domino effects, that is my nightmare. And they have done that through settlement, through infiltration in their institutions, including political parties, so that the government in office today, the Labour government, has done more to accommodate in the last 8 months than anything else. And that is my nightmare, that the West starts to fall apart.
So it's not a single event, though, not one dramatic attack.
It's not one dramatic attack. No. I think they will have, here's what happens. You can have a terrorist attack, and we will have more Islamist terrorist attacks on US soil, and we'll have it on European soil. But it is how we respond. If we respond to the terrorist attack by going at one another, or by our government kind of relaying the message to Americans and Europeans, get used to it, then that advances their cause. If we use the terrorist attack, the incident itself, to go after their infrastructure and end it, to introduce a bill, a law that identifies the ideological threat and go after it, I think then we'll be in better shape. I see that we have 1 minute, but I just want to touch on Israel and October 7. After October 7, Israel did the right thing, which was to go systematically after Hamas. That is, militarily speaking, ignore the slick and effective propaganda of the international community condemning Israel. By the way, that tells you how amazing they are, how their propaganda is amazing. And then they went after Hezbollah. They exposed Iran. So now Israel is in this place where they're actually very close to military victory. But they know, deep into their bone marrow, the Israelis know that that is a very temporary and one-sided victory, that the victory they need to achieve is the one of going after the ideology. And if that is followed, if these military successes are followed by a comprehensive ideological strategy for defeating the Islamists, we can be hopeful. If we go back to the two-state narrative, then I think we're in for another century of despair.
On that happy note, ladies and gentlemen, Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Thank you.